Welcome to the What I Wish I Knew After Pregnancy Loss podcast. I am your host, Shana Southern. I am an angel mum, a rainbow mum, a pregnancy loss practitioner, and trauma-informed coach. I created the Institute of Healing Through Pregnancy Loss out of my own experience with loss in the hopes to provide understanding and healing, educating people on pregnancy loss, and creating more women or men in trained support roles. In this podcast, I hope to shed light on what I wish I knew in relation to pregnancy loss, opening up the conversation, breaking the stigma, and bringing real-life stories plus guest experts. Thank you for being here with me today, and let's dive into today's episode. Hello, beautiful souls. Today's episode is a part 1 of a part 2 series. So I hope you enjoy listening into part 1 and make sure that you do listen into part 2 when it becomes available as well. Now let's dive in. Welcome, beautiful souls, to the What I Wish I Knew After Pregnancy Loss podcast. Today I have with me Amy Sagar. Amy is a funeral director and has spent 15 years supporting families and communities in caring for their dead and creating meaningful funeral ceremonies. Farewelling little ones has formed a large part of Amy's career in funeral service. Amy was the founding funeral director of a not-for-profit funeral home, Tender Funerals, which recently featured on ABC's Australian Story. Welcome to the show, Amy. Thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So do you want to share a little bit about, your story and sort of how you came to do what you do today?
Yeah, well, I will start by acknowledging that I am coming to you from Dharawal country, and I acknowledge the Wadi Wadi people who are the traditional owners of this land that I'm broadcasting to you from today. It's also where I work and where I live. I am a funeral director, and I've been a funeral director for 15 years, as you just heard. And I started very young in my career in the traditional funeral space, where I worked in all of the different roles in a funeral home, which involves meeting with a family after a loss has occurred, attending funerals, answering phones, doing on-call after hours, facilitating viewings. And then I eventually moved into the mortuary and doing the mortuary side, which was always what I was really passionate about as well. So I worked in the traditional space for 8 years, and around that time I really wanted to see a change happen in the funeral industry. And I wanted to see people being able to take back control of their funeral experiences, for people to be empowered, for them to have access to caring for their own dead, rather than it only being a mortician doing that. And it was really challenging trying to get access to that in an ordinary way in the traditional funeral industry. Mm-hmm. And when I heard about the Tender Funerals project, I knew that we needed this to exist. So I worked on making Tender possible. I joined the community in Port Kembla that was working on establishing that. And then we opened in 2016 as a not-for-profit funeral service, and we built our mortuary as a public space so that people would have the opportunity to be able to care for their dead if they'd like to. And we really just worked off a model of community empowerment and not making assumptions around what people's needs were, and just letting them determine their own capacity and make informed decisions about what they wanted as far as funerals go and as far as the care of their person goes as well. So over those years, by coming through that model of just asking people what they want and just doing that rather than applying a package or assumptions or anything like that, I landed myself in a position where I was caring for a lot of babies for people and for women who had experienced pregnancy loss. So I found that I was being called upon for that a lot, even early in my career as a traditional funeral director, because there were a few women that just felt really heard and had poor experiences and moved across to me as their funeral director. And because they had given their social workers the feedback around their experiences, we ended up being referred on to work with a lot more of those families in those situations. So I became quite experienced in working with all the various stages of pregnancy loss and the things that come immediately after that. So now here we are, 15 years later, and doing this work. And, community education is incredibly important to me. And so I'm grateful to be here today to share with you.
Thank you so much. And thank you just have such a beautiful presence, and just the way that you are here and your energy is just so beautiful. And I can sort of only sense how you would be able to then, use that beautiful presence to support women going through pregnancy loss, because it's definitely not something that is in a textbook or a rule book. And to have those structures sort of applied from a traditional funeral sense, it doesn't allow much space for pregnancy loss. And so, especially for the early stages, which I know that you do support women through those early stages as well. So do you want to maybe just elaborate a little bit about, I guess, how you support people through those different stages?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you're right. If you ask most people what a funeral looks like, they would be able to tell you, but normally they're talking about adult funerals. And then when you put it in context to the loss of a baby, and especially in the loss of a baby that was lost in utero during pregnancy, it's very hard to then translate those practices to that scenario. And the reality is that it is it's a different thing that we often do. And you're right, it totally varies upon every person, how far they are into their pregnancy, if it was a wanted pregnancy, if it was early in the pregnancy, or if it was a stillbirth, and then all of the different classifications that come with those different types of losses, the different legal requirements that come with those. So I think I'd probably like to start at early pregnancy loss, and we'll work our way through the different stages of pregnancy loss. Early miscarriage, I'm not clear on how many weeks. It might be around 14 weeks when it's no longer classed as early miscarriage, but it's sort of generally classified as miscarriage anyway. But for the subject of this, I'm going to say referring actually more up until about 10 weeks, let's say. And the reason that I'm going to classify it that way is because, those little babes are developing so quickly at those stages. And there is a big difference between what you're delivering very early in your pregnancy versus a little bit further on. And also what sort of babe you then have access to after the delivery as well. And so when we're talking about very early miscarriage, it can be tricky to identify the babe after it's delivered. And for some people, that might be experienced as a lot of blood, whereas other people might be able to identify which part of the discharge was their little one. And so I think what is really helpful is if we honor the fact that that is a whole process and that is a birth. And it doesn't matter if you were 4 weeks pregnant or if you were 42 weeks pregnant, they are all births and they are all passages of those births. And it can be tricky because in early miscarriage, you don't always have that identifying thing that is like, this represents my baby. And in those cases, it can be very helpful to have ceremonies or rituals tied to a moment or a place instead of the actual physical babe, because that's where it's really tricky. And I think a lot of people feel challenged because they're often flushing the toilet after they've been to the toilet and then feeling that concern, like, did I just flush my baby? I don't know. And, those are really big things that happen for those women. And I think that we just have to acknowledge that that is for some people a part of it and that that's okay. And that you can still do something for yourself or in your process of grief without having access to that. And that it's actually very common. So to affirm that for those people. in cases of D&C in a hospital where they have to do a medical clearance, then you can request for the tissue to be returned to you of anything that was in your uterus. But when that's returned to you in those early stages, it's not identifiable. And so what happens is you don't have the rules of things like it has to be released to a funeral director, for example. You would be able to take that home with you. And it just depends on what you want to engage with. Because for some people, that is so important to have that. And they might take it home with them. I know people who have had the experience of taking that home and placing it in their fridge at home so that it is kept in a controlled environment until they can determine what they want to do with that. And some people might want to take it to the funeral director and ask for it to be cremated. Other people, you could bury that in your backyard under a tree. There's no legal requirements as to the disposal of a babe at that size. So it's really unclear for a lot of people. It's murky water because they don't understand what you're allowed to do, and the law doesn't have great guidelines around that because it's so early.
Yeah. That was like a lot of my experience, and I didn't even know that I could request. I ended up in a hospital to get a DNC, and I didn't even know that that was an option for me. And I look back now and I'm like, I don't have anything. I don't have an ultrasound photo. I don't have anything tangible apart from my memories.
And that's almost where you have to assign something, right? Like you have to assign something to represent all of that. And that thing that you assign might be a ritual, or it might be a place. And it's so personal. It's so personal to you, but it is really helpful if you do have somewhere you can put all of that, and also somewhere that you can then use to visit all of that as well, is personal to you and everyone else that is experiencing that. But it is helpful. So if I could move along to a little bit further along in pregnancy and the loss that's associated with that, is by those stages, I'm still going to be talking about miscarriage. So I'll talk up to 20 weeks because after 20 weeks, a miscarriage becomes a stillbirth as long as the baby was over 40 grams. So if the baby's over 40 grams, then it also then gets classified as a stillbirth. But that time period, those little babes, they are little babes by then, and they're tiny, but they're there and you can identify them as a little being. And that for a lot of women is where it starts to change, because after the birth, they deliver an identifiable baby. And I think that is then for a lot of people when they want to start bringing a lot more ritual, or maybe are more supported to bring more ritual in. I think that might be a chicken and egg thing that you might be solving, Shana, is that perhaps maybe that's when the rest of the industry is identifying them as babies and treating it differently. But I suspect that's the crux of where that's come from. But those little babies, they're so little they could fit in my hand. And that is where those mums might want to spend some more time with those babies. And, you know, it's quite incredible because they can do things like taking photos of the baby, or to place that baby's tiny little hand on their finger, you know. And so there are those little interactions that are such beautiful slices of connection that people can have with their babies before they have to move along to be cremated or buried. And that window of time after delivery and before cremation or burial is possibly the most valuable window of time for any person who's experienced a pregnancy loss, because that is where the opportunity lies to reclaim your babe as yours, that they've been born. And so, you know, I invite anyone who feels that they want to have conversations with the people around them in that birth. If they want to see the baby, and if they don't want to see the baby, ask themselves what's stopping them, because they might be making assumptions around what the baby looks like and those sorts of things. So to ask themselves those questions, and if at the end of asking themselves those questions, it's a no, then they know that they have made that decision in their bones. And that's so helpful because they're less likely to regret that later. But if they say no, and everyone goes, okay, we're not going to bother you with it, and then after the cremation, they might say, I said no because I thought it was going to be a blob. And then you say, actually, it was a whole little person. And they might regret that. So I think it's about having these gentle conversations with mums after delivery around what they're wanting and what they understand of the circumstance and the experience, so that they have every opportunity. And also that model of continual offering. You know, they can't just ask someone after a baby's born and never ask them again, because where you are at that moment is very different to a day later, hours later, a week later. And so it's just important that people know that they can just change their mind, and that's fine. They're allowed to.
One in 4 pregnancies will result in miscarriage. 1 in 8 women will experience infertility. 1 in 100 women will experience recurrent miscarriage. And 1 in 160 births end in stillbirth. Have you been wanting to make a difference in the lives of women or men who have experienced pregnancy loss because you can see so many suffering in silence, but you just don't know how? Collectively, we can change how bereaved parents can access mental, physical and emotional support after their experience. There is a lot of women with unhealed trauma, and there is a huge gap in the current support system when it comes to bereaved parents' recovery after loss. There are too many women and men suffering in silence. The Pregnancy Loss Practitioner Certification is a worldwide, one-of-a-kind program that gives you proven methods designed for healthcare professionals, medical staff, midwives, nurses, doulas, birth workers, coaches, and angel parents alike. The Pregnancy Loss Practitioner Certification is bridging that gap. It will give you a proven support structure to follow and education specific to pregnancy loss, created by a lost mum. It is creating more education specifically for loss so that you can enhance your service and become the point of difference. Or you can create the support that you so desperately needed in your healing after loss. This is the next level of growth and expansion you have been searching for. So does this sound like something that you have been searching for? Let's explore this more together. You can head to the episode show notes where you'll find the program application, or direct message me on Instagram and let's open up the conversation in how you can use this education. You have a gift, and I look forward to supporting you and witnessing you bring your gift to the world, healing and transforming women's lives. It's really hard because when, like, you're talking about, you know, being able to have that space and time to make those decisions, and like you said, that continual offering. What I've heard a lot of is women in hospital, when they have obviously delivered their babies, they're then overwhelmed with people shoving forms in their face, telling them what is going to happen and how they want their baby. And a lot of women have said, you know, how they want their baby to be disposed of. And you're just like, it just seems so wrong. They're not given any time to make up their mind. It's like they're consumed with, you know, all of these different emotions, and the fact that they've just given birth to a stillborn, like they're stillbirth, and then they're overwhelmed with systems and structures and the next thing to do. And I love how you said that you're allowed to have that space, and you can take your baby back as yours, and you can have some time to think about it and ask yourself those powerful questions.
It's so helpful. And I think you're right. It's also tricky, that terminology of disposal, because it is a legal term, is the disposal of body. It comes from the New South Wales Health Act. And essentially that's what it is, but it's not helpful languaging immediately after you've lost a babe that you potentially really, really wanted and cared about.
Yeah.
And I say potentially because I hate to assume. I think that pregnancy loss is so dynamic, and pregnancy itself is so dynamic. And I just acknowledge that many pregnancies are yearned for, but some of them are not. And that's fair and valid. And I think that a lot of the pregnancy loss space focuses on wanted pregnancies for very obvious reasons. But I just want to validate as well anyone who's had an experience of pregnancy loss for a pregnancy that was perhaps not wanted, might be a result of unwanted sexual activity or for various other complex reasons. And just to validate those people, to say that sometimes those experiences of loss may come as a relief, but there might also still be some grief in that. Or maybe there's not grief and they're feeling guilty for not having grief around it. And just to say that all of that belongs and that it's not as black and white as you need to feel devastated and that some people don't. And just to put that in the spectrum of normal and that it belongs just as much, although it may not be the common experience, because I would say majority of pregnancies are really strongly desired to be coming full term and turning into little people.
Yeah.
I just always like to acknowledge that as well.
No, thank you for acknowledging it.
That's okay. If I can then continue on the conversation of that period before 20 weeks. So if I continue on that period before 20 weeks, those little babes are so small and so delicate that it can be very hard to do things like dress them in clothing. And so that's where you could do things like doing little wrappings of those babies, almost like a tiny, tiny swaddle. And that's possible. And parents can do that, or the mortician can do that, or the nursing staff. But also that angel gowns are a service that provide burial gowns for babies that are made out of donated wedding dresses. So it's like this cloth that has felt so much love by people and then is donated to this organization who also have a lot of love, and they stitch all of that into what they create and then they offer it to women so that when they have these tiny babies that don't fit up into clothing that you would find in the shops, they have something that is appropriate for that baby to be put in. And so, they're beautiful, they're gender neutral. Sometimes they come as little items of clothing like gowns. But for those little teeny tiny babes, they also make little pouches so that we can just slide that baby in and then tie it around them so that they are held and treated like little people. So you can acknowledge that baby as a being if you want to. And so I just offer that up because that's a free service in Australia. And if you don't have access to that in your hospital or through your funeral home, you can make contact with Angel Gowns and they will send you one of those. And sometimes they can also organize little keepsakes so that you can keep something to do with that little one as well. So I also just want to say that sometimes people who are at the age where they're having children, they don't always have a lot of money. And that seems to be a really common experience. And I just want to acknowledge that in the cases of those early losses where those babes are so small, you don't have to buy a full-sized coffin or even a specific coffin from the funeral director, especially when we're talking about cremation, but also sometimes for burial if you're going down those paths. You could provide or source like a beautiful little box if you wanted to, and that could save you a few $100s rather than buying what the funeral home has stocked as coffins, because they often are a few $100s from the suppliers, even though they're small. And it would come down to what the cemetery or the crematorium guidelines allow you to do, but it is legal to do so if it has a waterproof liner in it and is sealable. So, it's especially helpful when you don't have a lot of money to put into that. But the thing is as well that when you have a box, you can decorate that. You can put an artwork on that. You can write messages on it. So it doesn't have to feel like an exchange for less money. It's also an option if you want to do something that's deeply meaningful to you as well. So I just want to put that out there as a resource that's accessible for people. And as absurd as it sounds, you can go to places that sell gift boxes and they have beautiful gift boxes that actually I think are very appropriate for it, as long as it feels comfortable and right for you. So I'll just give you that, as well as then moving along to pregnancy losses that are over 20 weeks. And this is when we start to talk about stillbirth. When we're talking about stillbirth, the reason the conversation is different is because there are differences in the way that the law sees those babies. With New South Wales, the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages deems a difference between miscarriage and stillbirth. So if you have a miscarriage being before 20 weeks, then you could register for a recognition of loss certificate, but you don't register the birth, which is really quite upsetting for a lot of people. But after 20 weeks, you do have to register a birth with Births, Deaths and Marriages. And then when we're starting to talk about death certificates, you can only register a death certificate if the baby took a breath, because by that stage, it's no longer deemed a stillbirth, it's deemed a live birth, which means after air has passed through their lungs, they lived and then they died, which is sort of an awful definition of life, really. But it is the definition of the law, which is what we have to work around when we're talking about cremations and burials of people and registration. So even if we don't agree with it, unfortunately, we have to work around that model. But when we're coming to that section of stillbirth, our babes are bigger. They often can be dressed. And there are opportunities if parents want to be part of doing that dressing. Or they could do a swaddling, or they could use an angel gown. At all of these stages, those parents can take their babies home if they'd like to. And they can do that with the use of a cuddle cot. So a cuddle cot is it's a bassinet, and it has a little refrigerated, almost like a blanket or a sheet. It's like a malleable fabric, and it's cold. It's really, really cold. And it's important that it's cold because that's how you'll be able to keep your baby at home legally, and also in a way that they will be more presentable. Because as we know, if they're not refrigerated, the rate of decomposition and changes that can happen to their body will expedite and speed up. So that refrigeration is not only a legal requirement, but it's really helpful for the appearance of the baby too. So I'd really like to have a conversation about what that looks like and what that experience can be like. And most people don't realize that if they want to, they can put the baby in their car seat if they want to. And if they don't want to, they can have the baby in a bassinet and travel in a bassinet, holding them that way. And then when they get home, they would plug in their cool plate. There are instructions on how to set them up, and you can get them from a few different places. We have one that we can send out with people. Many hospitals have them now. Some funeral homes have them, and you can look online on where to hire them from. And it means that you can have your baby at home for up to 5 days. Some people might just want to do overnight or a few hours, and it's just about what's right for you. You can change your mind through the process. But for some people, that's so important to have that opportunity to bring their baby home. And at the same time, it's not necessary for everyone. You don't have to do it. And it's just about knowing, being in touch with what you want to do with those moments after birth and before cremation or burial. So it's nice to know that you've got that option. While we're talking about the opportunities that can come from spending time with the baby, I'd like to talk about the keepsakes that can be created while we have access to the little one. And that might look like taking ink prints of their hand. Fingerprints can be really hard because they're so tiny that it's hard to capture a lot of detail, which is why you see whole handprints being more common when it's for little ones. Those feet prints are also great. But then there's also this, it's like silver clay that you can get. And I know that you can buy it from Small Prints, and I think the Memory Smith, both of them have websites that create jewelry out of people's fingerprints and things. And the reason that these are so great, it's not flat like an ink print, it's 3-dimensional. So you can run your finger over the print and you can feel them. So there's a tactile connection that you can have. And then all you have to do is capture that. And once you've got that, you can then have it turned into something years later. That's fine. But it's just that little window of time where you have to capture that. They have really great things on their website that you can turn that into. If your baby is born with a lot of hair, then you can take a cutting of that hair, but a lot of little ones don't have hair. So it's only the rare few that really can capture that. But there is also an organisation called Heartfelt Photography. And Heartfelt Photography are professional photographers who volunteer their time to come and take professional grade photos of your baby. And you might want to be present for that shoot and have that opportunity to capture images of you with your baby. Or you may choose to not be present and they can capture images in your absence with your permission. And you might feel unsure about that. And my advice to you would be that if you're unsure about if you want that, then I would recommend getting it and choosing for them to never send you the photos than to not have the opportunity. So you might decide after the cremation or the burial that actually you definitely don't want them, and you can ask them to delete those photos, and they will. They have absolute integrity in their service. But it is so helpful for you to have all of the options up your sleeve and not be stuck in a decision that you made in a time of enormous distress. So it's just nice to have the options.
Yeah, it's some of these like that I have never heard of before. So, thank you for being able to bring awareness to the different ways that you can create these keepsakes as well. And also to acknowledge like that you might be in that moment of, you're going to be in a moment of overwhelming grief and heartache, but you don't also want to look back and wish that you had have done it. So maybe just allowing yourself that space and just leaning into the fact that you might not want it now, but what might you want a little bit down the track? And if it's the photography, like they can delete those photos if you choose down the track that you don't want them. I think it's beautiful.
And the photography is done so beautifully, so discreetly. Like it might just be a photograph of the sole of their foot. It doesn't have to be the whole baby if that's confronting for someone. So they do beautiful work. And I think for me, the important thing is that people know that they have that option while they can still act on it. And if they choose no, that's fine. But the thing is that they got to choose no. And later on, they can say, I chose not to have that, rather than I didn't know that that was an option. And that empowerment in itself can completely change someone's experience.
Yeah.
So it's just about knowing that that is a thing and that you can access it. And then what you do with that is no one else's business. It's just about you having that option.
Yeah, exactly. It's just that option because, for myself, looking back, I wish I had so much. Now that I know what's available, I'm like, I wish I had that knowledge and awareness for when I was going through it. So to have this awareness and to know what you can do it's incredible. And you'll be able to then take those things with you and have these memories. But like you said, if you choose no, you've made that conscious choice. And that's something that you'll most often will be okay with down the track. But if you choose no in a moment of, like you said, distress or panic or grief, and then later on down the track, you wish you had it available, it's a really different feeling because, for myself, it feels like there's still something missing. Like I have my memories, but I have nothing else. And it always feels like there's just that little thing missing, something tangible for myself. So yeah, just to have this awareness of what's available is a very empowering thing.
It's the power of informed decision making. It's so helpful, and it doesn't solve your grief, but it's like a little puzzle piece that goes into it all. If I could, I suppose, also talk about the opportunities that could come from what you can do in the time leading up to the cremation or the burial, in context to have a think about what you might want to place with your baby as well. Would you like to send the baby with a blanket or a toy, maybe something that you've bought for them, that you want them to have something that you bought for them? You could write them a letter or create an artwork or put in photographs of mum and dad in the coffin. And then if there's siblings, if you've already got children and you experience a pregnancy loss, there is a whole conversation and thing that happens there around how to talk to your children about the death as well. And in that processing is invitations. If those children want to put something in that coffin, do they want to choose a toy or an item or create an artwork as a way for integrating a family participation and conversation around it all too? You can take cuttings of your own hair, put it in with the babe. Like, it's endless. It's so endless. And you could even do things like you could tie a ribbon around the baby's hand and then take a cutting of the length of the other end of that ribbon, and you can keep that so that there is something that you have and there's the other half of that with the baby, and you'll always know that that was the other half of that is with them. A bit like a friendship necklace. And, if you've got siblings, maybe they want to put a friendship necklace in there. It's a way of having creative thought put into the practice and creating your own meanings around that. And that can be anything. You might light a candle at the vigil, and then that candle might forever be the candle that you light in memory. And when that candle's burnt down, the glass jar that it came in has tea lights in it, and that will always be the candle that was burnt at that time. And so we can create our own connections and meanings for all of those things. And it's just like having the idea in the first place is the tricky part. That's the tricky part. I think that there's also opportunities around the placenta. The placenta, you can have artworks made out of the placenta where they do placenta prints, or you could take your placenta and bury it under a tree. So there's interesting ways you can have a look at what you can do with the placenta as well. And that might be your link to be able to be a part of remembering that loss.
I think that's a beautiful thing as well that I wouldn't have even thought of.
I think the other tricky thing is that if you're far enough along in your pregnancy, then your milk will still come in as well. And I'm not very clear on that process, really. But I do know that you can get jewelry made out of breast milk. And so if in those circumstances, if it's appropriate to be pumping, there are things that you can do with that milk if it goes to a milk bank, or if you want to get a keepsake made out of your breast milk as well, can be an option too. And I think they even take things like cuttings of umbilical cords to make keepsakes for those. So if you look at, or get a friend perhaps to look at what keepsakes are made for babies who are born living, and see if any of those could be captured for a baby that's died as well. That might even be things like taking a plaster cast of the baby's whole hand, and then it comes out as a hand that you can hold like a little statue of a hand. And that can be really helpful for some people too. So there's all of those things that exist as keepsakes for babies who are born. Most of those can transfer for a baby that's born still as well.
I did come across a website here in Australia. I was looking at milk keepsakes, and I have a feeling they had a baby loss, a pregnancy loss keepsake collection. So I might see if I can find it, and I'll link it in with this episode, because if it does, it might sort of help as well. I know it might only be Australia, but there might be similar things, and then you could sort of research for yourself in terms of where you are in the world.
You can Google baby loss keepsakes and memorials, because there are services that make those, but that's not all of them have something to do with the body, right? And so that means that you can do them at any time. And because I've found one on Etsy that really starts from like 3 weeks gestation, they make keepsakes, and they use clay to make a form of the baby and set it in a resin heart.
Yeah.
And so then obviously the form of your baby is at a different stage. And it's, I think, a brilliant way to recognize an early loss when you don't have anything, is that you have this little form that represents the form that your baby would have taken in its physical part here. So I always thought that's really cool. But I'm trying to, I suppose, keep my focus on this little window of opportunity that comes before a cremation or a burial.
Yeah. And what you can do in that time to be able to honour your baby.
That's right. And so I think that when we're talking about what those ceremonies might look like, in early loss, it's not common for people to have funerals. but there's also no right or wrong. So everyone does what's appropriate for them. And I find that when we have funerals for babies, normally it is in very late in pregnancy when the loss is, when people have funerals. And in those funerals, it's often very small and informal. And I've seen that baby passed around in those funerals. Everyone has a turn holding the baby, or maybe the parents might take the baby out of the coffin and hold them for the duration of that time. And so I just want to say that anything goes. If you're going to a viewing for your baby, you are allowed to pick them up and hold them if you want to. And you can ask your funeral director for any guidance or support around that if you're feeling unsure about how to handle that, because it can be tricky. And, they can be quite delicate as well. And it just depends on their gestation and the condition that they're in, because I would recommend that if families want to spend time with their babies, that they do it sooner rather than later. And that's just because they're so small that their bodies change quite quickly. And you can observe those changes normally each day as it goes. And some of them might be slight and unnoticeable, and others might be very noticeable. And so I would say that while there is no rush in having a funeral or doing the cremation or the burial, I would be having these conversations about whether they want to spend the time with the baby really early so that they have the time to consider it and then have access to it earlier, rather than waiting. Okay, you've delivered the baby, we're going to give you some space and not talk to you, and now we're going to ask, but now it's a lot later down the line. So I think that the key is about having the conversation early so they have time to make up their mind and still be able to do that at a time that's earlier than otherwise. It's a delicate thing, but it's so worth it to have those conversations.
Yeah, and to have it with someone that is able to support you, like to have that, the funeral director and the support system around you that can be open to all of that, and to have these conversations with you it's a very special moment in time to be able to have, and to have those people around you that can support those decisions and choices as well.
That's right. And, the important thing to know is that your baby actually legally belongs to you. And so if someone is telling you that you can't see the baby, they're wrong. And I don't think it happens very much now. I think that's a very outdated practice. But in case anyone is having that situation, but they don't know, that baby belongs to you. You have the choice.
I think that's very important too, because you do feel almost like once the system takes over, it's like you don't have that much of a say in it anymore.
I suppose I should add to that might be a little bit different in coronial cases. So if there is any kind of investigation that's happening, there might be a period where you are separated from your baby. And that's a very unique circumstance, and certainly not the common circumstance. But once the investigation has ended is when you get to then reclaim all of those rights around accessing the baby.
Yeah. I think, it's a very important piece of awareness. And I think that awareness is like through our whole conversations, just having that awareness of what you can do, what your rights are, and that you can have the time to actually make these informed decisions and to have the awareness of what you can actually do. Thank you for listening in with me today. I hope you found this episode helpful. If you did, I would absolutely love to hear from you. Take a screenshot of this episode, share it to social media, and tag me at Institute of Healing _PL. I love seeing what is resonating with you right now. If you want to chat further, I invite you to connect with me through Instagram. Head over and follow my Instagram account, send me a DM, and let's open the communication. If you want to know more about how you can be the support for others, head to the show notes and fill out the application form for the Pregnancy Loss Practitioner certification. I want to also note here that what I share within the episodes is not medical advice. If you need further support, please consult your doctor. Thank you again. Much love to you. Be gentle with yourself, and I look forward to supporting you on the next episode.